Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. So today we're diving straight into what is easily one of the most famous and, quite frankly, one of the most tragic stories in modern history. We're looking at the Titanic. You already know, it was this massive, highly celebrated British passenger liner custom-built by the Harland and Wolff shipyard for the White Star Line. Back then, this thing was the absolute pinnacle of luxury and engineering. I mean, it was one of the largest, most opulent ships the world had literally ever seen. But, well, as we all know, this story definitely does not end with a triumphant arrival in New York.
So let's dive into it. How exactly did this absolute marvel of engineering, a ship practically universally celebrated as the safest thing on the water, meet such a devastating end? Today, we're going to break down the timeline, the catastrophic failures, and the lasting legacy of a ship that was literally built to conquer the sea, but was swallowed by it instead.
Section 1. The Maiden Voyage.
Now, the public and the press back then absolutely bought into the hype. They really believed the Titanic was exceptionally safe. Basically, the idea was that modern engineering had finally outsmarted nature. And honestly, it's a tragic irony, right? The immense, almost blind confidence everyone had in this ship's design is exactly what makes the impending disaster so shocking. People weren't just boarding a high-end luxury cruise. They thought they were boarding an invincible fortress.
Section 2. Timeline of Tragedy.
So the scale of this whole project was just massive, right from the jump. Construction kicked off in Belfast back in 1909, taking years of meticulous labor. Fast forward to May 31st, 1911, and she's finally launched into the water. Then comes the big one, the maiden voyage. April 10, 1912. The Titanic leaves Southampton, making these strategic stops at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown, which is Cove today, over in Ireland. It's picking up all these passengers so excited for a new life or just a fancy vacation in New York City. But then, April 14, at exactly 11:40 p.m., the unthinkable happens. The ship strikes an iceberg in the pitch-black waters of the North Atlantic, and by 2:20 a.m. on April 15, the mighty Titanic breaks apart and totally sinks.
2 hours and 40 minutes. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. That is all the time it took from the exact moment that iceberg tore into the hull at 11:40 p.m. to the moment she broke apart and sank into the abyss at 2:20 a.m. Less than 3 hours. For a ship of this unprecedented massive size, one widely believed to be exceptionally safe, to be reduced to a sinking wreck in 2 hours and 40 minutes, it's just absolutely staggering.
Section 3. The Human Cost.
So, there were about 2,224 passengers and crew members on board, and guys, the losses were just catastrophic. Roughly 1,500 people perished in those freezing waters that night, only around 710 survived. And a lot of those survivors owed their lives to the RMS Carpathia, which showed up later to pull them from the dark ocean. When you really sit down and grasp those numbers, the sheer scale of the heartbreak really hits you.
Because of that staggering loss of life, the Titanic immediately became, and still remains today, one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history. Think about that. This wasn't an act of war. It was a standard passenger voyage, a totally peacetime journey that ended in this completely unprecedented tragedy.
Section 4. Why so many died.
Now, you might be wondering, how did so many die? What exact systemic failures or human errors turned a bad collision into a total catastrophe? Well, it really just comes down to grim, awful math. The ship was carrying over 2,200 people, but there simply were not enough lifeboats for everyone. The crazy part? The ship was actually legally compliant with the regulations of the time, which were incredibly outdated. So practically speaking, it was woefully unequipped for a full evacuation. They built this floating palace for over 2,200 people, but they literally didn't plan for how to save them all if things went wrong.
And honestly, the lack of lifeboats was really just the first problem. The evacuation itself was incredibly chaotic. You had lifeboats being launched partially empty. In fact, the very first boat to drop had a capacity for 65 people, but it took off with only 28. And for those who were forced into the ocean, that freezing Atlantic water was just unforgiving. The extreme cold caused rapid hypothermia. So tragically, most of those 1,500 deaths didn't happen from drowning over a long period. They occurred within mere minutes of hitting the water.
Section 5. Changing Maritime Safety Forever.
Because of the Titanic, ships today are strictly required to carry enough lifeboats for every single person on board, no exceptions. This tragedy also forced continuous 24-hour radio communication, making sure a distress call is never missed in the dead of night again. It even birthed the International Ice Patrol, which, believe it or not, still monitors icebergs today. The whole global framework for maritime safety was completely overhauled.
So next time you step onto a modern cruise ship and go through those mandatory safety drills, you are looking right at the direct legacy of the Titanic.
Section 6. Discovering the wreck.
Fast forward to 1985, and a major breakthrough finally happened. An expedition led by Robert Ballard discovered the actual wreck of the Titanic. And it was resting way down, about 3,800 meters or 12,500 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic. The sheer depth and the total darkness of its final resting place really just adds to the haunting nature of the whole story. It's this permanent deep-sea monument to that night in 1912.
Of course, that 1985 discovery sparked a massive resurgence of interest. The Titanic remains one of the most famous stories in human history for a reason. It's inspired countless books, tons of in-depth historical documentaries, and yeah, obviously the massive blockbuster film. Through all this media and storytelling, the memory of those passengers, the crew, and the ship itself just continues to capture the imagination of generations all over the world.
Which leaves us with this final kind of heavy thought to ponder. The Titanic was the ultimate symbol of human confidence, right? A total marvel that we swore was exceptionally safe. Yet it was completely undone in less than 3 hours by a block of ice. It really forces us to ask, in the face of nature's totally unpredictable and immense power, will our ever-evolving safety regulations ever truly be enough to conquer human hubris? It's a question that definitely resonates far beyond the North Atlantic. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this structured look at the facts gave you a fresh perspective on such a history-defining tragedy. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.